Okay, let's dive into this. Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're unpacking a deeply complex, multi-theater intelligence synthesis known as Operation Omnifracture. Think of this whole thing as a clinical sitrep, a situation report, detailing a synchronized global failure across logistics, geopolitics, and domestic infrastructure. We're going to translate a terminal systemic rupture into a clear, no-nonsense briefing. So lock in because the operational window for preparation is closing, and it's closing violently. Right off the bat, here is the bottom line up front, the bluff. The global geopolitical and macro-financial sandtable isn't just bending right now. It is literally fracturing across all primary nodes. According to the latest intelligence telemetry, the system is actively entering what's designated as condition black. What that actually means for you and me is that the converging threats we're about to look at, they're no longer hypothetical. The window to get prepared is actively slamming shut. To make sense of all this, we'll break this intelligence briefing down into 4 distinct vectors. Vector Alpha, kinetic escalation. Vector Bravo, logistical paralysis. Vector Charlie, bioenvironmental threats. And finally, strategic directives. Starting with Vector Alpha, kinetic escalation. And this brilliantly illustrates how the old diplomatic framework has effectively died, triggering a total chain reaction. We're looking at Iran's formal refusal to exfiltrate its highly enriched uranium to a third-party nation. That acts as a definitive zero-day trigger, because by holding on to this fissile material, they retain a zero-day nuclear breakout threshold. That refusal is the exact linchpin required for the US and the IDF to anticipate resuming kinetic strikes. And the immediate response? The Strait of Hormuz will transition from a basic policing action straight into a dual-control active war zone. Now that transition in the Strait carries immediate, devastating mathematical consequences. 20% of the entire world's oil supply routes straight through the Strait of Hormuz. The very second that waterway becomes a designated war zone lined with smart mines, maritime insurance is immediately voided, gone. And without insurance, those massive supertankers simply do not move. The intelligence models project an immediate algorithmic panic, trapping that 20% indefinitely and violently gapping global energy costs upward. Simultaneously, we've got Operation Dragon's Breath, the Sino-Russian summit. Outwardly, China and Russia are projecting this total alignment, right? They're targeting U.S. missile defenses and integrating tech and Harbin. But the real story here is the asymmetric friction. China is ruthlessly withholding signatures on the massive Power of Siberia 2 pipeline deadlock. Why? Because they are demanding incredibly cheap, domestic-level spot market pricing for Russian oil. It's a highly pragmatic play. China secures bottomless cheap energy to insulate Eurasia from the Hormuz shock, while the U.S. consumer is left to just absorb an accelerated structural 3.8% inflation rate. Which brings us to Vector Bravo, logistical paralysis. This energy shock slams us right into a financial phenomenon known as super-backwardation. Typically, futures contracts cost more than immediate physical goods. But during a terminal supply shock, traders suddenly realize that paper contracts for next month's delivery are completely worthless if the maritime lanes are mined. So they panic. They'll bid astronomical premiums. We're talking $20 to $40 over standard pricing just to take physical possession of a barrel of diesel today. The spot price completely detaches from the futures market and gaps violently upward. This super-backwardation creates what the Intel calls a velocity snap. It's a violently compressed 14 to 21-day timeline of total logistical exhaustion. Days 1 through 3 bring the paper shock, as maritime insurance voids. By days 7 to 10, the route freeze hits. Supertankers drop anchor at safe harbor nodes, absolutely refusing to transit. And by days 14 to 21, we hit the pump infarction. Regional fuel terminals are forced to enact strict allocation quotas, completely freezing out independent trucking and paralyzing our overland freight. You know, corporate executives often project confidence by pointing to the paper ledger. They rely on corporate finance, financial fuel hedging, and algorithmic routing to navigate high prices. But this explainer is squarely focused on the physical ledger, because thermodynamics dictate reality. If your local distribution tank is physically empty, you cannot power a Class 8 semi-truck with a Wall Street financial derivative. Fiat currency simply does not combust. And because our massive retail architectures rely heavily on just-in-time delivery, meaning they hold only a few days of inventory, they are incredibly fragile. When the public realizes that independent stores are failing, panic buying will funnel exclusively into mega retailers. The sheer velocity of consumer extraction will strip a massive retail supercenter entirely bare in just 6 to 12 hours. The math simply hits a thermodynamic wall.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how adversaries will exploit these digital connective vulnerabilities. They aren't just going to wait for the diesel to run dry, they'll actively target civilian lifelines. We're looking at Precision Ag Cyberlock, where zero-day ransomware bricks modern GPS-dependent tractors right in the field. We're seeing the threat of cold chain infarction, where grid attacks cause backup pharmacy generators to fail, spoiling critical biologics like insulin. And then there's clearinghouse paralysis, DDoS attacks on electronic freight dispatch systems that essentially blindfold the trucking network, inducing localized famine even if the trucks happen to be fully fueled.
Next up is Vector Charlie, bioenvironmental threats. The threat matrix here is perfectly, terribly synchronized. We have an undetected spread of Central African Ebola, intersecting precisely with an active pharmaceutical ingredient shortage. Add to that Mexican cartels moving 35-ton narcotic shipments, which creates unmonitored human logistics pipelines that serve as perfect pathogen vectors. On the caloric side, meteorologists are projecting an 1877-level El Niño, which practically guarantees severe crop destruction. And if that wasn't enough, a recent Texas Attorney General pesticide settlement revealed major domestic grocery chains were secretly treating organic produce with off-label chemicals, completely destroying consumer trust, just as the global food supply tightens.
Finally, strategic directives, actionable plans for mitigation.
So the crucial point is this. We are actively pivoting to condition black. We have to shift away from theoretical models and move immediately into actionable, localized mitigation for what we call the sovereign hearth. To survive this, we must overcome the rural island paradox. See, a lot of rural communities assume that geographic distance from major cities automatically equals safety. But according to the intelligence models, using areas like Grants Pass as a template, your rural footprint is actually just a terminal node at the very end of incredibly fragile logistical pipelines. A blocked mountain pass or a dry regional fuel terminal isolates you entirely within 72 hours.
Once that isolation hits, the domestic threat matrix activates hard. You will face syndicate exploitation, where highly organized criminal groups pivot away from illicit trade to violent territorial control and asset seizure. You're going to see the desperation swarm, where displaced urban populations transition from passive encampments to aggressive foraging as food banks freeze up. And finally, there's the very real threat of weaponized wildfires, where hostile actors use arson as a distraction protocol to completely exhaust local emergency management resources.
Let's move to and see how this builds into a non-negotiable set of localized hardening protocols. Step 1. Establish absolute caloric and hydration autonomy. If your well pump relies on the municipal grid, you do not have water. Get off-grid solar well pumps or gravity-fed cisterns. Step 2. Institute a 360-degree security perimeter utilizing passive landscaping and independent Wi-Fi-free triple arms. Step 3. Deploy encrypted mesh networks. Use concentric GeoInt mappers and GMRS or LoRa radios to coordinate with your neighbors, because you cannot defend an isolated footprint alone. Step 4. Execute aggressive firebreak engineering. Clear out that defensible space, because when this hits, the fire department will simply be out of diesel.
So, we leave you with this final critical thought. Take a hard look at your local setup. Is your localized footprint a truly self-sustaining ecosystem, or are you just a terminal node waiting for a delivery that is never going to come? The 14 to 21-day window is violently compressing right now. Assess your vulnerabilities, execute your hardening protocols, and secure your perimeter. Thanks for joining us on this explainer. Stay vigilant and start preparing today.